The dirt on the Endecott farm was the color of a fresh wound, a deep, rusted crimson that clung to boots with a wet, sucking grasp. For 50 years, the land had lain fallow, the skeletal timbers of the barn and farmhouse standing against the bruised sky like a gibbet. The locals in the nearby town never spoke of it, not directly. They'd just nod towards the crooked lane that led to its gates and say, "The soil's too rich there. Things grow different." Eleanor and Mark saw only potential. They saw space for their 2 children to run free, away from the city's grit. They saw the sagging porch not as a thing of decay, but as a place for future summer evenings. The real estate agent, a pallid man who refused to step out of his car, called it a character property. The price was a secret whispered in a dead man's ear. Their first week was painted in the soft hues of optimism. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the dust motes in the old farmhouse. Their laughter echoed in the empty rooms, a sound that seemed to startle the very silence. But the silence here was not empty, it was a held breath. It was the land itself that first whispered the truth. Mark, a man who believed in the simple logic of seed and soil, was the first to feel it. He'd sink his hands into that dark, loamy earth and his fingers would brush against things that were not stone, smooth, porous fragments that felt disconcertingly like bone. The well water, ice-cold and clear, carried a faint, coppery tang, like a penny on the tongue. Eleanor found the garden. It was behind the house, a plot that had not been tended in half a century, yet the soil was black and friable, utterly devoid of weeds. On a whim, she planted a handful of tomato seeds. Overnight, it seemed, violent green shoots erupted from the ground. Within days, the plants were grotesquely large, heavy with fruit that glowed a hypnotic, bloody red. When she picked one, its skin was warm, and the stem wept a thick, milky sap. That night, they ate the tomatoes with their dinner. They were delicious, impossibly so, a flavor so profound it felt less like eating and more like consuming a memory. But the dreams that followed were not of sunshine and rain. They were dreams of a deep, subterranean dark, of the slow, patient turning of roots through soft, yielding matter, and a profound, gnawing hunger that no food could ever satisfy. The family woke together, in the deep hour of the night, each having surfaced from the same nightmare. The old house creaked around them, and from the direction of the blighted garden, they could hear it, a low, wet, tearing sound, as if the earth itself was feeding. The decision to purchase the Endecott farm was not born of careful planning but of a desperate, city-worn fatigue. For Eleanor and Mark, the glossy, sun-dappled photograph in the online listing was a siren's call, a promise of silence and space after years drowned in the cacophony of traffic and cramped apartments. The price was the first jarring note, a figure so laughably low it felt like a typo, a secret oversight they were terrified would be corrected if they hesitated. When the real estate agent, a Mr. Thorpe, finally replied to their inquiry, his voice was a dry, rustling leaf of a thing, devoid of the usual salesman's enthusiasm. He arranged the viewing for a Tuesday afternoon, insisting on a specific time, as if guided by a tide table or some other obscure, natural law. The journey there was a slow peeling away of the modern world. The tarmac gave way to gravel, which in turn narrowed into a dirt track flanked by a tunnel of skeletal, grasping birch trees. The car bumped along the ruts, and the family fell silent, the children in the backseat ceasing their bickering as the oppressive green gloom closed in. When they emerged into the clearing, the property was laid out before them under a sky the color of tarnished silver. It was not a welcoming sight. The farmhouse slumped on its foundation like a tired old beast, its windows boarded up not with neat plywood, but with rough, rotting planks that looked chewed into place. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the grey expanse, its great door hanging open to reveal a profound and unsettling darkness within. Yet, it was the land itself that held their gaze. It wasn't the gentle brown of wholesome earth, but a deep, almost Venus red, a color that seemed to swallow the thin daylight. Mr. Thorpe did not get out of his car. He merely rolled down his window, the electric whine startlingly loud in the hush, and gestured with a pale hand. "The keys are in the lock," he said, his eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. "Take all the time you need." He did not offer a tour. As they walked the property, a profound silence pressed in on them, a thick blanket that smothered sound. There were no birds, no insects, only the soft, sucking noise their shoes made in the damp, crimson soil. The children, initially excited, grew quiet and clung to their parents' legs. Mark, ever the pragmatist, kicked at the earth and marveled at its texture, deep and loamy. "You could grow anything here," he muttered to Eleanor, his voice a hushed intrusion. She nodded, but her eyes were on the lone oak tree that dominated the rear field, its branches twisted into agonized shapes, from which strange, thorned vines grew in suffocating coils. They found the small, general store in the nearest town a mere collection of weathered buildings that seemed to watch their passage with dormant hostility. When Mark mentioned the Endecott place to the man behind the counter, the air in the store froze solid. The man, old and lean with a face like a roadmap of hard years, stopped polishing his glass and fixed them with a flat, empty stare. He didn't offer a warning, not in words. He simply said, "Soil's tired," and turned his back. It was not the truth, and they knew it wasn't. It was a dismissal, a final line drawn in the sand. That silent, communal rejection, that refusal to even speak the name, was the final, perverse reassurance they needed. It confirmed their city-bred suspicion that these were just simple, superstitious folk, afraid of a little hard work and history. They saw the isolation as privacy, the silence as peace, and the cold warnings as the faded echoes of a forgotten gossip. They signed the papers the next day, their pens scratching loudly in Mr. Thorpe's silent office, the deed to their perfect future, and their damnation. Sealed with the dry rustle of official documents and the unspoken horror they were too blind to see, the first harvest was an obscenity of abundance, a violent eruption of life from the wounded-looking soil that defied all reason and season. It began with the tomatoes Eleanor had planted, their vines swelling into thick, hairy ropes that strangled the stakes and clawed at the garden fence, heavy with fruit that glistened like freshly skinned organs. The corn grew tall and far too quickly, the stalks as thick as a man's wrist, their leaves casting long, finger-like shadows that seemed to pluck at their clothes as they passed. The air in the garden grew thick and warm, carrying a cloying, sweet scent that was undercut by something else, something metallic and coppery, like the smell of a licked battery or blood on the tongue. Mark, who had initially celebrated this grotesque fertility, found himself working in a nervous silence, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled carrots from the earth. They came up not in the cheerful, orange clusters he expected, but as twisted, forked things, their surfaces a pale, veined white that too closely resembled human flesh. That first meal was a quiet, almost ceremonial affair. The food steamed on their plates, the colors preternaturally vibrant. The corn kernels were a bloody purple gold, and when pierced, they wept a creamy, opalescent juice. The tomatoes, sliced open, revealed a fleshy, deep red interior that was unsettlingly substantial. The first bite was a revelation, a flavor so profound and complex it was almost unbearable. It was rich, savory, and deeply satisfying, a taste that seemed to bypass the tongue and speak directly to some primal, hungry part of the brain. For a moment, seated around their old kitchen table in the flickering lantern light, they were a perfect, contented unit, their earlier anxieties washed away by this wave of sensory pleasure. But the satisfaction was a lie, a fleeting precursor to the truth. That night, the dreams came for them all, not as separate nightmares but as a shared descent into the same suffocating darkness. They did not dream of monsters with claws and teeth, but of the earth itself. They felt the cool, dense press of the red soil around them, the slow, inexorable push of roots through damp, yielding matter that was not wood or stone. They felt a profound, gnawing hunger, a hollow ache that originated not in their own bellies but from the land, a demand for sustenance that was both ancient and insatiable. They woke together, as if by a silent alarm, in the dead of night. The house was cold, the strange, sweet metallic scent of the garden now clinging to their skin and hair. From outside, carried on a wind that shouldn't have been blowing, came a low, wet, tearing sound, a rhythmic squelch and pull, as of something being unearthed or something being buried, feeding or being consumed. They lay in the dark, none of them speaking, the exquisite taste of the harvest now ashes in their mouths, replaced by the chilling certainty that they had not harvested a crop, but had, in fact, answered a call to a dinner table where they were not the guests, but the meal itself, slowly being prepared for a palate they could not comprehend. The discovery was made by their son, Leo, a quiet boy of 7 whose world was still small enough to be defined by the flight path of a brightly colored ball. It was a cheap, bouncy thing, garish red and yellow, a relic from a gas station stop on their journey to this new life. He had been kicking it listlessly against the side of the barn, the dull thud a lonely sound in the heavy afternoon air, when a mezquite sent it skittering through a gap in the warped boards, into the barn's deep and perpetual twilight. He pushed inside after it, the immense space swallowing the small sound of his footsteps. The air in the barn was old and still, thick with the ghosts of hay and a sharper, more alarming scent of old iron and damp earth. Dust motes, disturbed by his entrance, danced like agitated spirits in the single shard of sunlight cutting through a high, cobwebbed window. His ball had come to rest not against a wall or a piece of forgotten machinery, but had vanished into a patch of particularly deep shadow near the back, where the packed earth floor seemed to dip. Kneeling, he saw it had rolled into a depression, a shallow, almost imperceptible hollow that his adult parents would have missed. The earth there was not packed hard like the rest of the floor, but was loose and friable, a pile of that same dark, reddish soil that seemed to infest every inch of this place. As he scooped his ball out, his small fingers brushed against something cold and unyielding hidden just beneath the surface. It wasn't a rock. Curiosity overcoming the instinctive prickle of fear on his neck, he began to dig, scraping away the loose dirt with his hands. He uncovered a ring, thick and black and pitted with rust, set into a square of aged, splintering wood. It was a handle. It was a door. He tugged, but it was far too heavy for him. He ran for his father, his small heart hammering not with excitement, but with a strange, cold dread he couldn't name. Mark, sighing with the mild exasperation of a man interrupted, followed his son back into the gloom. He saw the ring, gripped it with both hands, and with a grunt of effort, pulled. The door came up with a groan of protesting wood and a shower of dirt and rust, revealing a yawning blackness that exhaled a breath of air so cold and damp it felt like the grave itself had opened up. The smell that poured out was unmistakable now, a cellar smell, yes, of wet stone and decay, but underneath it was that coppery tang, intensified 100-fold, mixed with something else, something foul and sweet like spoiled meat. Mark fetched a flashlight, its beam a frail, trembling wand in the absolute dark. The steps were rough-hewn stone, slick with a dark, mossy dampness. As he descended, the beam played over the walls, which were not stone but the raw, red earth of the farm, held back by ancient, rotting timbers from which thick, pale roots snaked like veins. The floor of the subcellar was hard-packed dirt. And laid out upon it, not stored away but arranged with a chilling sense of order, were the tools. They were not for farming. There were long, curved blades on thick wooden handles, their edges still gleaming with a malicious sharpness despite the rust spotting their surfaces. There were saws with teeth designed not for wood, but for something else entirely, something that would require a cleaner, more brutal cut. There were heavy, cleaver-like axes and strange, hook-ended instruments whose purpose he could not begin to fathom, all resting there as if waiting, patiently, for the season's work to begin. The silence in the pit was not empty, it was the silence of a workshop between shifts, and he, standing there with his weak, modern light, was the new apprentice who had just stumbled upon his forebears' trade. The soil's secret began to reveal itself not through a sudden, ghastly discovery, but through the slow, meticulous language of data, a language Mark had always trusted implicitly. His initial awe at the land's impossible fertility had curdled, over weeks, into a nagging, professional unease. As a man who believed in balanced equations and natural laws, the violent abundance of the harvest felt less like a blessing and more like a symptom of a profound dysfunction. The plants grew with a frantic, almost aggressive vigor, their root systems so dense and deep they seemed to be wresting something from the earth rather than simply drawing sustenance from it. He decided to run a basic soil test, a habit from his former life, unpacking his kit with the solemnity of a ritual, seeking to quantify the magic and perhaps quiet the superstitious dread coiling in his own gut. The initial readings were staggering, off the charts in a way that made his instruments seem broken. The levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium were astronomically high, a nutrient profile that should have burned the roots of any ordinary plant to a crisp. Yet here, everything thrived. It was the organic matter content that truly defied logic. The test indicated a percentage so impossibly high it suggested the very earth was more biological matter than mineral, a thick, living sludge of decay and regeneration. He sent a sample away to a lab in the city, a place of sterile whitecoats and calibrated machines far removed from the oppressive silence of the farm. When the email arrived, its clinical subject line felt like an artifact from another world. The report was a cold, hard slab of truth. The soil was indeed saturated with organic compounds, but the analysis noted anomalies that the lab's standard parameters struggled to classify. Traces of complex proteins and lipids were present in configurations that were, as the report dryly stated, atypical for standard agricultural biomass. It was the supplemental note, a single line added almost as an afterthought, that turned the blood in his veins to ice. It read, "Further analysis indicates a significant presence of specific keratinous and osseous biomarkers, consistent with a high-density concentration of degraded biological material of a mammalian, and specifically, anthropoid, origin." He read the sentence once, then again, the sterile, academic words failing to contain the horror they described. Mammalian. Anthropoid. The coppery taste in the well water. The warm, fleshy texture of the tomatoes. The twisted, forked carrots that looked like limbs. The soil wasn't just fertile, it was composed. It was a vast, open grave, a compost heap of souls, and every vibrant, terrifying plant that grew from it was a monument to what had been buried there, their roots tangled in the slow, patient dissolution of bones and flesh, feeding on the horror that had sustained the Endecotts for generations, and was now, he realized with a dizzying wave of nausea, sustaining his own family. The dog's illness was the fracture through which the truth began to seep. Buster, a cheerful, mud-loving Labrador, had been their one piece of unchanged, uncomplicated city life. He spent his days roaming the property, digging with a joyful, mindless enthusiasm. His favorite spot was a shaded patch of earth near the property's northern border, where the soil was peculiarly soft and loose, as if it had been turned over many times. He would return from these excavations panting, his muzzle and paws stained a dark, rusty red. They thought nothing of it until he began to fail. It started with a profound lethargy, then a refusal to eat. Within 2 days, he was violently ill, his body convulsing as he vomited up a dark, foul-smelling gruel. The local vet, a man named Dr. Evans with a kind, weathered face, could find no poison, no parasite, no logical cause. He kept the dog overnight for observation, and when Mark went to retrieve Buster, who was, miraculously, showing signs of recovery, the vet's demeanor had changed. The professional kindness was still there, but it was now layered over with a deep, unspoken caution. "Keeps digging in that same spot, you said?" he asked, his eyes not on Mark, but on the antiseptic floor of the clinic. Mark nodded. The vet was silent for a long moment, as if weighing a terrible burden. "There's an old man," he said finally, his voice low. "Alistair Finch. Lives in the white cottage at the end of the mill road. His family has been here a long time. Longer than most. He might have some thoughts on how to discourage the dog from digging there." The suggestion was so pointed, so specific, it felt less like advice and more like a directive. Mark found Alistair Finch sitting on a rickety porch, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked as old as he was. He was a gnarled man, his eyes pale and set deep in a web of wrinkles. He did not invite Mark to sit. When Mark mentioned the Endecott place, the old man's knife stilled. He didn't look up. "That dog of yours," Finch said, his voice a dry rasp. "It's tasting the history in that soil. Gets in their blood, that history." He fell. Silent again, and Mark felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. "The Endecotts," the old man continued, staring out at the distant, brooding line of trees that separated his land from theirs. "They were a solitary lot. Never kept livestock. Not a single cow, not a pig, not a chicken. No need for a butcher's bill, you see." He gave a short, hollow laugh that held no humor. "But their smokehouse," he said, and now he did turn his pale, knowing eyes on Mark, pinning him to the spot. "Their smokehouse, now, that thing was never cold. Summer or winter, drought or flood, there was always a fire in that pit, always a thick, greasy smoke curling up from that chimney. Always a smell on the wind. A peculiar smell. Not like any pork or beef I ever knew." He turned back to his whittling, the conversation clearly over. "Keep your dog close, mister. Or next time, the soil might not let him go." The words hung in the air, more damning than any accusation. The truth was no longer a ghost story, it was a simple, horrifying statement of fact. They had no livestock. But the smokehouse was always active. The ledger was found in the deep silence of a rain-lashed afternoon, a day when the farmhouse seemed to shrink under the low, bruised sky, its walls groaning under the assault of the wind. Eleanor, driven by a restless need to impose order on the creeping chaos, had decided to finally tackle the attic, a space they had all subconsciously avoided. It was a tomb of forgotten things, filled with the sharp, sweet smell of old wood and decay. Under a heap of moth-eaten wool blankets, tucked inside a small, brass-bound chest that was suspiciously free of dust, she found it. The cover was of a thick, blotchy leather that felt unpleasantly supple, and it was tied shut with a leather thong. The pages within were brittle and yellowed, filled not with financial accounts or crop rotations, but with a neat, looping script that detailed a different kind of inventory. The entries were chillingly mundane in their structure, dated and itemized like any shopkeeper's records. But the items listed were not bushels of wheat or corn. They were cuts of meat, given names that were both archaic and horrifyingly specific. Long pig, the term appeared again and again, next to weights and notes on curing. Winter guest, full provision, read an entry from December 1898, with subsequent lines detailing 2 hams, rib section, and organ meats, salted. Summer visitor, lean, from July 1912, yielded jerky and stew bones. The dates spanned nearly 7 decades, a meticulous chronicle of harvests that had nothing to do with the field. The horror was not just in the words, but in the casual, domestic notes scrawled in the margins. A trifle stringy, but the smoke improves it, one entry read. Another, next to a listing for marrow, stated, excellent for the root vegetables. The parsnips have never been so robust. It was a cookbook of atrocities, a housewife's journal detailing the most efficient way to render a human being into pantry staples. The final entry, dated the autumn the last Endecott was said to have vanished, was the most succinct. It read, "The land is sated. For now." Holding the book, Eleanor felt the cold, greasy weight of the leather seep into her skin. This was no longer a legend whispered by fearful neighbors. This was the family Bible, the foundational text of the farm. It documented the true source of the soil's unending fertility, the grim reciprocity that fed the land. The Endecotts hadn't just been cannibals, they had been farmers in the most monstrous sense, cultivating a crop that required a very specific, and terribly willing, kind of fertilizer. The ledger in her hands was their story, and with a sickening lurch, she understood that her family, by simply being here, by eating from this land, had already begun to write the next chapter. The change did not come as a storm, but as a fog, a gradual dimming of the light within them that they barely noticed until the world outside had grown pale and indistinct. It began with the silence. The anxious conversations about the soil test, the ledger, the vet's grim warning, all simply ceased. The questions that had once burned in their minds now seemed distant and irrelevant, like the troubles of another family in another house. A profound lassitude settled over them, a physical heaviness that made the simplest tasks, washing a dish, carrying firewood, feel Herculean. Their movements became slow, deliberate, their voices flat and devoid of inflection. They no longer ate their meals at the table, but standing in the kitchen or sitting on the floor, their eyes distant, their chewing methodical and slow. The food from the garden was now the only thing that held any appeal. The canned goods they had brought with them sat untouched in the pantry, their labels seeming garish and foreign. The hunger was the worst of it. It was a deep, hollow ache that the abundant, bloody tomatoes and the fleshy carrots could only placate for an hour or two before returning, sharper and more insistent. It was a hunger that seemed to originate not in their stomachs, but in the very marrow of their bones, a cellular demand for the specific sustenance the land provided. Their eyes took on a new cast, a dull, yellowish gleam in the dim light of the house, and their gazes now followed not each other, but the world beyond their windows. They watched the distant road, not with hope, but with a patient, measuring stillness. When a utility truck rumbled up their lane one afternoon, its engine a vulgar intrusion, they did not rush to greet it. Instead, they watched from the shadows of the porch, not as potential recipients of aid, but as predators observing a grazing animal. The man, cheerful and bored, was there to read a meter they didn't have. Mark listened to his easy chatter about the weather, the state of the roads, his plans for the weekend, and the words sounded not like language, but like noise. He looked at the man's sun-reddened neck, the pulse beating steadily at his throat, the sturdy flesh of his forearms, and a thought, cool and smooth as a river stone, settled in his mind: provision. There was no horror in the thought, no revulsion. It was a simple, practical assessment, the same way he might once have looked at a fallen tree and calculated how much firewood it would yield. The family's fear had not been conquered, it had been digested. The land, working through the food they consumed, had rewritten their instincts. The primal terror of being consumed had been quietly, efficiently replaced by the calm, patient logic of the consumer. They were no longer victims trapped on the farm, they were its agents, its new caretakers, and their growing hunger was the land's own appetite, looking out through their eyes, measuring every passing stranger not as a person, but as a potential yield, a means to enrich the soil for the next, terrible harvest. The hikers' arrival was a tear in the fabric of their isolation, a sudden, jarring intrusion of the outside world that should have been a relief but felt, instead, like a profound violation. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with a brightly colored backpack and a map held out in front of him like a talisman. He had taken a wrong turn off the main trail, he explained, his voice breathless and apologetic as he stood on their porch. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. In the old days, Eleanor would have ushered him in immediately, offering coffee, the phone, a warm seat by the fire. Now, she and Mark simply stood in the doorway, a united front of silence, their faces impassive. They did not invite him in, but they did not send him away either. They watched him. They noted the healthy sheen of sweat on his brow, the strong, corded muscles of his calves, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, full of a vibrant, unthinking life that was an affront to their own deepening lethargy. The old, human part of Mark's brain, a tiny, flickering signal in the static, screamed that they should give him directions, point him back toward the road, wish him well. But that voice was drowned out by a deeper, more resonant hum, a frequency that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath their feet. It was a hum of opportunity. The land was hungry. The garden, for the first time, was looking peaked. The tomatoes had begun to shrivel on the vine, their vibrant red fading to a sickly pink. The hiker was not a person in need. He was a resource that had, through a fortunate twist of fate, delivered itself to their doorstep. "It's getting dark," Mark said, his voice a low, rusty gate hinge of a sound. "The trails are dangerous at night. You should stay." The words were not an offer of hospitality, but a statement of fact, a verdict. The hiker, whose name was Alex, hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his friendly face. But the alternative was the deepening woods, and the family's stillness, while odd, did not yet feel threatening. He stepped across the threshold. The family did not offer him a phone or the internet. They offered him a meal. As Eleanor moved to the kitchen, her movements were no longer sluggish but purposeful, efficient. She did not retrieve a can from the pantry. She went out to the dying garden and returned with an armful of the last, desperate vegetables, their forms twisted and strange. The meal she prepared was a thick, dark stew. It steamed on the table, filling the small dining room with that now familiar cloying, metallic scent. As Alex ate, praising the unique flavor, the family watched him, their expressions unreadable. They were not sharing a meal with him. They were assessing the quality of the provisions he would become, calculating the yield, already feeling the land's grateful anticipation. The invitation had not been to dinner, but to become it. The hiker's departure was not marked by the crunch of his boots on the gravel lane or a wave from the porch. It was marked by a new, profound silence that settled over the property, a silence that felt different from the one before. It was a sated silence, a contented hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth. Alex had simply ceased to be a guest and had become a project, a necessary and unspoken piece of farm work that was undertaken in the deep of the night with the same grim efficiency as mending a fence or clearing a drain. The tools from the subcellar, which had felt so alien and menacing in their discovery, now felt familiar and right in their hands, their way to comfort, their purpose clear. There was no ceremony to it, only a dreadful practicality, a harvesting as inevitable as pulling a carrot from the ground. The family worked together, their movements synchronized as if guided by a single, ancient mind, their shared hunger having forged them into a single organism serving the land. When the work was done, and the evidence of their labor had been rendered down into manageable portions, some for the smokehouse, whose cold chimney would soon bloom with a familiar, greasy smoke, the rest for the earth itself, a strange peace descended upon them. The gnawing emptiness in their guts was, for the first time in weeks, completely gone, replaced by a warm, solid fullness. The following morning, the change on the farm was immediate and visible. The garden, which had been withering, now pulsed with renewed life. Overnight, new, aggressive shoots burst from the soil, their leaves a darker, glossier green. The remaining tomatoes swelled, their skin tightening back into that familiar, bloody red. But the most dramatic transformation was in a fresh patch of earth near the base of the twisted oak tree, a patch that had not been there the day before. The soil there was darker, almost black, and it steamed faintly in the cool dawn air, as if breathing. Within days, a crop of strange, phosphorescent mushrooms pushed through the surface, their caps pale and fleshy, followed by the swift, violent growth of a gourd vine that bore fruit the color of old bone. This was the cycle. This was the transaction. The land had been fed, and it was already giving back, its fertility renewed by the most potent fertilizer of all. The hiker was gone, but he was not lost. He was everywhere. He was in the rich, loamy scent on the air. He was in the impossible vitality of the plants. He was in the satisfied quiet of the family, who no longer looked towards the road with anxiety, but with a patient, knowing expectation. They had not gotten away with a crime. They had successfully completed a harvest. The horror was not in the act, but in the normalization of it, the way the farm seamlessly wove the atrocity into the fabric of its seasons, making it as natural and as necessary as the rain. The legacy was not a curse, it was a recipe, and they had just followed it for the first time. The final turning of the key within them was not a violent act, but a quiet, seamless click, the sound of a lock accepting its one true key. The struggle was over. The last vestiges of their former selves, the city dwellers who feared the dark, who recoiled from the coppery taste in the water, who saw the ledger as a record of monstrosity, had been digested and expelled, like a harmless toxin. The peace they felt now was absolute, a profound and unshakable serenity that flowed up from the soil, through the soles of their feet, and into their hearts. The questions were gone. There was only the land and its needs, which were now indistinguishable from their own. They no longer saw the farm as a place they owned, but as a living entity they served, a demanding and generous God that asked for a specific kind of tribute and rewarded them with a bounty that shut out all other thoughts. The memory of the hiker, Alex, caused no ripple of guilt or nightmare. It was a pleasant, hazy recollection, like remembering a particularly successful day of gardening. He had served his purpose, and the proof was in the vibrant, almost delirious health of the new crops, in the way the very air seemed thicker, more nourishing to breathe. They began to maintain the farm not as homeowners, but as curators of a sacred right. Mark spent days patiently sharpening the tools in the subcellar, oiling the blades until they gleamed in the lantern light, his touch reverent. Eleanor took over the ledger, her own neat hand now filling a fresh page, her entries calm and precise, a continuation of the grim accounting that stretched back over a century. They taught their children not about algebra or history, but about the signs of a lean season, about how to identify a potential provision from the way they walked, the vitality in their eyes, the sturdy health of their bodies. When a car would occasionally slow on the distant road, or a lost hunter would wander near the border of their property, the family would not hide. They would stand together, watching, their faces neutral, their eyes holding a calm, patient knowledge. They were the Endecotts now. The name, which had once been a whispered curse from the townsfolk, was now their identity, a title passed down through the soil itself. The horror was not something they lived with, it was the foundation upon which they lived. The farm had chosen them, tested them, and found them worthy. They were its guardians, its priests, and its harvesters. The cycle was complete, and they would ensure it turned forever, their roots now sunk as deep and as irrevocably into the bloody ground as the gnarled oak itself, waiting in the quiet, perpetual dusk for the next season, and the next guest, to arrive.